Good evening. My name is Joe Kolars, and I'm Director of the Center for Global Health Equity. Thank you for joining us for what has been a series of monthly seminars that obviously connect to our center. If you look in the chat box, you can see our website. For some of you who may be new to our center, we're organizing our work around some themes that have had a lot of resonance by faculty across our campus, faculty who are connected to communities in low-income countries. We also have a series of challenge groups that you'll find that our faculty are organized into. Data science for global health, climate vulnerability and global health, empowering women in communities. These are all very active challenge groups. Tonight we have the opportunity to hear from another one of our challenge groups, and that is designing for impact in global health. And this has been a great team. And I'm going to turn the seminar over to Professor Kathleen Sienko, who is in our College of Engineering. Kathleen has a panel of speakers who are going to be reflecting on some of their collective work and ideas and have time for us to also engage in discussion and questions. So Kathleen and team, thanks for coming together for this evening's seminar. Kathleen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Joe. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to learn more about our Challenge Groups initiatives. The Designing for Impact in Global Health Challenge Groups efforts are aimed at reducing morbidity and mortality through the development and implementation of health technologies that are appropriate, accessible, and affordable. My name is Kathleen Sienko, and I'm a faculty member in the Department of Mechanical Engineering. I'm co-leading the Designing for Impact in Global Health Challenge Group with my colleague, Paul Clyde from the William Davidson Institute. Today, you will be hearing about prior and planned work from several of our challenge group members, including Jesse Austin-Breneman, David Green, Grace Burlson, Kentaro Toyama, Rocky Oteng, and Paul Clyde. Starting us off is Professor Toyama from the School of Information.
Thanks, Kathleen. So I want to start with this slide that a colleague of mine took, I guess it's now been over a decade ago, but he and I were considering different ways in which we could convey information about agriculture and nutrition for smallholder farmers in South India. And we were trying all kinds of ways to use different kinds of digital information tools to convey information and to engage these farming households. And this happens to be one of them. Now, in this age of Zoom, I'll say that I have not yet met all of my colleagues on this team in person. But one thing I do know is that collectively, we have a lot of experience working in some of the world's most remote locations, trying to understand exactly what kind of context they work in. We also come from different disciplines. Some of us have a somewhat critical view of attempts to design technologies. Other of us are always optimistic and believe we can design great technologies to suit a particular context. But one thing I believe we all agree on is that what's represented in this photograph doesn't work, which is to say, you can't just take a technology that works well in another context, transplant it, and expect that people in that new context will be able to take it up and take advantage of it. Next slide, please. And more from kind of the perspective of the engineer as well as the entrepreneur. There are all kinds of representations of the fundamental challenges that exist between going from an idea of using, applying some kind of technology for the cause of global healthcare and getting it to a point where it's actually having large scale impact. In this kind of cartoon, you can see that there are people who talk about it as the valley of death. There are just many different chasms you have to cross. Each one arguably requires a different kind of skill. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that despite a significant amount of research literature that identifies the problem, there's relatively little that formalizes the nature of the actual individual chasms and how you can successfully clear them. Next slide, please. This is one framework that we are kind of using to think of our work as a team. And it basically breaks down some of the barriers into 3 categories. So it's a little bit hard to see because it's small, but I'll just read these out. Barrier 1 is that the necessary technology doesn't exist. Barrier 2 is that the technology may exist, but it's not widely accessible. And that may be for a number of reasons, including cost, but other issues as well. And barrier 3 is that the technology is accessible, but is not adopted. Next slide, please. And so we see our work as a team as roughly being responses to each of those 3 barriers. So the first one, where the technology doesn't exist, we have to learn better how to design these technologies in a way that are adequate to that specific context. To respond to barrier 2, we need to be able to find better models of improving the availability of a technology once it's been designed and appears to work in a given context. And then for barrier 3, we have to find ways to better improve the training of people who might ultimately use the technologies. And so that would improve adoption. Next slide, please. Overall, we see our larger objective as being to reduce morbidity and mortality through the development and demonstration of scalable models for strengthening global health technology, both in terms of commercialization and implementation. And this kind of captures end-to-end what our team is interested in doing. We have considered at various points, whether we want to focus this on a particular class of global health challenges. That's something that is still up in the air for us. But over the next few slides, you'll see different ways in which we're engaging with this problem. Next slide, please. And our team is actually larger than the speakers that are represented here today. We have other representation from the School of Public Policy, the law school, as well as business, medicine, engineering, law, and design science who are represented right now. And I will pass the baton to Grace.
At this stage, I'd like to introduce Ms. Grace Burlson, who will be talking about some of the prior and future work related to improving design through better incorporation of contextual factors.
Thanks so much. I'm really glad to be here, and thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. So in design, contextual factors refer to specific attributes that are dependent on a design's specific location or setting. And this is where the product is intended to be implemented or used. And right now you're looking at a framework that categorized contextual factors into 9 groups. This was developed by Aranda Jan et al. In 2016. This framework allows us to look at a design's context more holistically. For example, different climates and weather would fall under the geographical and environmental category. And here we know factors like temperature and humidity may impact material choice, for example. Another example could be language and religious or cultural practices, which can strongly influence product use and perceptions. And this would fall under the socio-cultural category. Next slide. So it's widely acknowledged in literature and practice that contextual factors need to be considered to some extent during design, but it's unclear which specific factors are important or necessary, and then where within the design stages they should be incorporated. So with this in mind, our specific research group is asking the following questions. How are contextual factors incorporated in practice? And then how can contextual factors be better incorporated into design processes? Next slide. So looking at the literature, we conducted a review of 186 papers that presented the design of a product intended to be used within a global health or development application. We pulled from 3 places in the literature. And as you see in this figure, we found that papers that reported some level of contextual investigation relied on qualitative methods like interviews, observations, or surveys, and that a smaller number focused on more performance-based field tests. And for papers that performed the qualitative contextual investigation, these ranged greatly in how data were collected, synthesized, and applied to design decisions. And importantly, when reporting, the designers and authors of the papers rarely provided details about how specific and unique contextual factors really impacted the design and decision making. Next slide. So in our current study, we are investigating how novice designers incorporate contextual factors. We've interviewed students and reviewed design documents for engineering senior level design courses, of which half are global health focused projects. And our initial findings have identified various ways that students are incorporating contextual factors across these key design stages that you see here. Here on the left, during early stage problem scoping, students are investigating contextual factors via interviews with stakeholders, observations of the context, and also through their secondary research. Next, when students develop requirements and specifications, they're incorporating contextual factors in a variety of ways, but mainly including quantifiable contextual factors and not so much qualitative ones. Next, we're not seeing reporting of context during concept generation, but we are seeing it during concept selection, where some students are using context-specific criteria to narrow down and select a final design concept. And then in more back-end design stages like refinement, students are iterating design features to accommodate specific contextual factors and also verifying design concepts in context or even simulating the context. Next slide. So overall, we are seeing a high variability in the incorporation of contextual factors across the teams that we reviewed. However, the most attended to factors are those that are closest to the technology, such as technological and institutional factors, and factors that feel further away, like political or sociocultural, are mostly neglected. And along similar lines, quantifiable contextual factors are more likely to be incorporated, and students have difficulty collecting, synthesizing, and applying qualitative information to design decisions. So some of our initial recommendations include following the contextual factor category framework as sort of a checklist to approach the design context more holistically and consider more factors. Also, engaging a broader set of stakeholders when exploring context may lead to incorporating more relevant factors. And importantly, we encourage design reporting and descriptions to include context-based rationale and methods so that we can better assess how contextual factors actually really matter in design. And this work is still ongoing, and we plan to investigate expert and experienced design practices in our next study. Thank you.
Thank you, Grace. Next up, Professor Jesse Austin-Breneman from Mechanical Engineering will be discussing another perspective and approach to understanding how the incorporation of contextual factors could improve design.
Yes, thank you, Professor Sienko, and thank you everyone for sharing your time with us this evening. So the thing that I'm going to talk about right now is an incorporation. We're sort of connecting all of these themes we're going to be talking about tonight together. In particular, we're looking at how do we engineer sustainable impact? And in this case, we're trying to answer a question: how do we actually reduce morbidity and mortality through the use of development of new technologies or new global health technologies? And we want to know sort of ahead of time when we're designing, is this really an opportunity that we should be pursuing? Do we believe that this technology that we're working on has the potential, and actually connect it to that impact? And in general, I'm just gonna, this sort of graphic here, just to talk about sort of the three pillars of sustainability. And so you have economic impact, environmental impact, and social impact. And I would say in this case, we can see here some of the prior work of people trying to connect some of these engineering parameters, some of this design work when you're trying to work on developing the technology itself to that impact that you're looking for. So, for a long time, people have been trying to predict the economic impacts. You can see things like design for market systems. What is this technology going to do in a market environment? In environmental work, we've seen people look at things like sustainable building design or sustainable life cycle design. And again, these are sort of engineering analysis techniques in order to make predictions about what is that potential impact. Now, what we have less of, and what you heard Grace mention a lot about, is some of these more social contextual factors, so things like quality of life. So we would think of something like a health outcome as a quality of life outcome. And what we would hope is that we would know ahead of time, hey, this technology we're working on really has the potential to change somebody's quality of life. And I think there's not a lot of tools. You can see those are papers from last year and they're not validated. There's a lot of work left to be done. And I'm gonna talk now, if we go to the next slide, sort of walk you through what our approach is, one approach that we're trying out to try again, connect the engineering design work to the impact that we hope to have by developing this technology. And as Professor Toyama mentioned, we know that a lot of times there are these chasms where when you're trying to develop this technology, you're not going to get to that impact. And you want to know before you try and cross them, hey, do we think that there's actually a potential for change here? So this is just engineering design. It's one of Paul and Beitz. This is a seminal sort of process model. You saw a process model from Grace earlier. So engineering design in general tries to take us from sort of these abstract user needs to concrete engineering specifications. So you might go and you're going to see a lot of sort of these gated processes where we talk about planning the task, and you do your conceptual design, your embodiment design, and your detailed design. And if you go to the next slide, similarly, you might use an optimization framework. And here again, you're just going from those design concepts and attributes. What is this artifact? What are its features? What is the features of this technology? What can it do? To something that you want, which in this case usually is here it's enterprise utility, but it's like an economic benefit. You're saying what we're getting out of this technology is that we're going to sell it. So I think overall, when you think about engineering design methods, the formal strategies we currently have that we tell people you should design this way, we are picking, and if you go to the next thing, we're really saying, what innovation will you buy? So as engineers, I think mechanical engineers particularly, we're really trying to answer this question of, okay, what features do you want? Let's understand your needs such that I can design an innovation, a health innovation, for example, that you will buy, right? That we have a customer in mind, some target customer, and we're trying to do that. The problem is, if we go to the next slide, that we actually want to improve the quality of life. We want to know, hey, is this technology, are we developing in the right direction? Is this the right opportunity to actually have impact? And so what we're going to do, what we're trying to do in our challenge group is incorporate implementation science, some of the constructs and concepts from implementation science, which is from the healthcare industry, into engineering design. And in implementation science, I'm not an expert, but I'll just generalize here in saying that you have some health innovation, you have some new technology, and you want to, that you believe will have a quality of life outcome. And implementation science is about the study of how do we get people to adopt that innovation within an organization, right? So you're looking at determinants of use. So you see here, you have an implementation strategy. I have this innovation. How am I going to get this? There are decisions you can make to try and improve the chances of success that this organization will adopt your innovation. And you can see the environmental influences. We have determinants of use. We go to use outcomes, which are adoption, implementation, and maintenance. And these are things that affect the actual, reduction of morbidity, for example, or mortality. And so what we want to do, if we go to the next thing, this is really saying, how can we get you to adopt an innovation? So in engineering design, we're saying, hey, what can I make that you will buy? And in implementation science, I believe that they're saying, my understanding is that it's how can we get you to adopt this thing we already have? So if we go forward, sorry, quickly. I think the current approach is we sort of have this over the wall piece in the middle. We say, okay, let's design this attributes we understand. We can incorporate some more contextual factors to maybe make a better thing, but we're coming up with some functional innovation. Here's a new technology that does something new, right? This is an innovation that we think will help. But I think the key thing is to get any of the quality of life outcomes, we need some of that help from implementation science to say, what's our strategy for getting people to use this? So can you go forward? So what we're proposing here is an integrated approach where we bring some of that understanding about the implementation strategy. That could be a market strategy if you're a company and you're selling it, or it could be an implementation strategy if you're within a hospital system or you're a government. We want to understand some information about that and the thing that we're designing at the same time, how that affects the determinants of use, which then affect adoption, which then affects the quality of life. So what we want to do is, if we can know something about the implementation strategy when we're designing it, we can actually change the design of the innovation to make it easier to implement with our strategy, or potentially more successful with our implementation. We've done some case studies, and we have some papers that are not in the global health space, but we're very excited because, you know, implementation science is from the healthcare space. We think it'll be more directly applicable to take some of the things you're going to hear about coming up, whether that's the capacity, building capacity among community health workers or other types of health workers. If we know something about that, we can design our technology to be amenable to that implementation strategy. If we know the market strategy of the organization that's trying to scale this up, we can then take it and say, okay, well, let's design it to make it easier to implement within your market strategy. So we want to bring some of those decisions earlier on in the design process and use that to build better technologies, or develop better technologies that we believe have a higher potential for success in actually having an impact on the quality of life or the health outcomes in this case. So the question I'm trying to answer here within our group is, what innovation will actually impact your health, right? So we're not trying to say, which one will you buy? We're saying, okay, which one are you going to adopt? And by adopting it, actually impact your health. And so I think that's it. And I'll pass it back to Professor Sienko. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. Next up, Professor Paul Clyde and Mr. David Green will be talking about our plans and prior work aimed at improving technology availability through commercialization.
Thanks, Kathleen. So building on what Jesse was just talking about, this section, this thrust is focused on actually getting products to customers and having them used. And in particular, we're talking about commercialization. And if we think about social and economic impact, from an economic perspective, we look at value of use that a customer has and the willingness to pay, and that gives some sense of how much value they're getting from the product. And then on the production side, you've got the cost of producing it or the cost of providing it, which would include the skilled technicians that are needed to be involved in that. And if the value exceeds the cost, then there is social value there. And that's one of the reasons, getting back to one of the things that Joe's been emphasizing with us all along, is the impact. That's one concrete way of measuring impact. It's not the only way, but certainly one concrete way of measuring it is if customers are willing to pay for it and it cover the cost of producing it, value is created in society, and there is social impact from that in addition to economic impact. So that's what we are sort of focusing on this, and we want to take advantage of the breadth of the opportunities across campus, which I'll touch on briefly in a second. But just to lay out our ultimate goal, I think, is to think about the products and the design. And so you'll see these thrusts are interacting with each other because, as Jesse was talking about, whatever we learn on the commercialization side may be an input into the design, the design component of it up front. But then ultimately, we want to partner with some organization in one of the countries we work with, to take this on as a product and actually see this as part of their viable business. And David's going to talk in a second about a prime example of that, Aura Labs in India, where their Aravind Eye Hospital started manufacturing their own intraocular lenses, among other things, that they are now selling, and they're selling profitably in places around the world. But the idea, David was very involved in developing that in the first place, but that idea then evolved into something much more, much larger over the years. And that's a great example of impact with a local company, that organization that is producing it. Next slide. So just to give you an idea of how we think about this, we saw the other frameworks on the design process, and we're early on in this. So Joe wanted to have a conversation early on. So we're early on, and we're going to be thinking about how all these react to each other and work together. But this is a sort of a generic gating process that companies might use, that they walk through different phases. And before they move on to the next stage, they do some background research. For example, they'll come up with an idea, and then they'll do some basic background research to see, is there a market there? And if there isn't a market there for this product, a large enough group of consumers that would be willing to pay enough to cover the cost, they would stop that at that point. But if there is, that's not enough. You would go on to subsequent stages, and each stage along the way, you're making an investment, a further investment, to see, does this product warrant further investments, and ultimately, ideally, taking it to market and launching it. Along the way, a lot of products are going to drop off. You're going to find that they don't work. And in fact, you go to the next slide, Kathleen. Early on, you'll want to develop some sort of filtering that tells you something about the probability of success. And we are in the process of developing that too. And in both these cases, these exist in companies. What we want to do is figure out how to most effectively integrate them into what we're doing here at the university. And I think University of Michigan is uniquely qualified to do this because of the breadth and depths of schools that we have. But we taking something to the end stage where you're actually launching product, and we want to actually do that. I mean, we as a university, we do a lot of research and a lot of thinking about what could theoretically work, but often we'll drop it off before it actually makes it to market. One of our goals is to actually take a few. We're not going to be able to do a lot of these, but we're planning to start with one or two, and really working with local providers to see, can we take this to the marketplace and make it so it's actually used and adopted by consumers. But in order to do that, Kathleen has a lot of projects coming out of her classes. There are other schools that have product ideas coming out of them. We have to have a filtering process to see, what are we even going to enter into this gating process that we have, because it's costly to go through all these. So we're developing that right now as well. And then next slide, Kathleen. And then we want to draw on all the resources around the university. We, at the William Davidson Institute, we focus on the business opportunities in low and middle income countries. And while I'm at the business school, we work with schools across campus, and it's amazing the resources that are out there. These are some that we work with, the tech transfer office, there's a venture capital office, there is a international transactions clinic at the law school, all of which can be used to combine, and each of them are in many cases combining educational opportunities with actual work that's getting done. But the breadth of opportunities there are to work with experts across campus is really remarkable. And so I think one of the things we're trying to do within this challenge group is tap into that and turn that into a reality in terms of a few, on a fairly regular basis, having some products that come out that are actually making it into the marketplace and are used by the individuals, that the patients or the hospitals or the clinics out there in a commercial way. And so with that, I'd like to turn it over to David now, who's going to walk through some examples. As I mentioned, he worked on the RL lab, but he's working also with us on another possibility. David?
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. So the idea of focusing on pacemakers came out of an introduction that Joe Collars did to Dr. Thomas Crawford, an electrophysiologist, cardiologist, and we started talking about the need for pacemakers in developing countries. And I had already worked with a consulting firm, Innosight and Medtronic, to create the Healthy Heart for All initiative that started in India, that looked at how to reduce cost, pricing, and barriers for low-income people to get pacemakers to address arrhythmia. So I had some context for the project. So, this led to coming up with the idea to do a feasibility study. And I'll mention that I'm kind of like a folk artist developer. I'm not an engineer. I don't have an MBA. My degree is actually in health behavior, health education from the School of Public Health at University of Michigan, which was almost 40 years ago. So, so I don't really have any background in any of this, but I've managed to do a number of product developments and bring them to market, and I'll talk about a few of those. So with the pacemaker, the key element really is to find a person that knows what they're doing, who's been there, done that. And so we've Paul and I, along with some external assistance from people in cardiology, have created a feasibility study looking at comparing what would it take to make a traditional pacemaker versus something new, which would be a pacemaker that would attach via a different surgical technique to the outside of the heart and be a leadless pacemaker rather than having leads going from the pacemaker through the blood vessels inside the heart. And so what we would be doing is looking at all the different inventions already out there. And this feasibility study mainly focuses on technical feasibility, not so much the business model part. So we would be looking at intellectual property, what is off patent now that could be useful, what are the key patents of anything that we're interested in, how strong are those patents. We'd be looking at the components for the two different products that we'd be examining. What is the bill of material? Do we have to manufacture it? Can it be sourced off the shelf? What about the CMOS, the chip and the software development? And then we'd be looking at potential manufacturing sites, contract manufacturers, or manufacturers that we would set up. And then what would be the projected startup costs for each stage of product design and prototyping, regulatory, manufacturing, the initial sales runway. So we would look at the project holistically in determining how much it would cost. The other thing I'll mention here is we'd be looking at finance. And a lot of the work I do is figure out what is the right type of finance that leads to the right type of business model with the right type of value system to ensure pricing for affordability to low-income people. So that's a key feature of the project. How do you gain control of intellectual property to be in control of technology, manufacturing, and ultimately pricing to ensure affordability? So that would all be rolled up in this. And then, of course, they're studying the regulatory pathway to determine FDA, CE mark certification, what is the regulatory process for large markets like India or China, or even smaller markets, and what are some of the risks involved in that regulatory fulfillment, and what would it cost? And then we'd be looking at the type of surgeon implanting each of these types of pacemakers. A lot of my work is figuring out how to make products and procedures able to be utilized by less skilled personnel. So how do we enable a general surgeon and not an electrophysiologist, cardiologist to be doing pacemaker implantation? What are the skills necessary? What type of training programs you need to have? And then we'd be looking at the equipment for implementation to determine if we do make a new type of technology, would we be able to have lower cost equipment for the actual surgical procedure? And then, of course, we'd be looking at all the risks and defining all of those risks. Next slide, please. So Paul mentioned Oralab, and I actually, Oralab has its origins in me going to Kellogg and begging for used supplies from the operating theater and sending them to our event. That's how I got going back in the early 80s. And then I thought, okay, well, why should I be begging these things? Why don't I ask companies to donate them? So I developed a very big in-kind donation program where I must have gotten 200,000 intraocular lenses donated over an 8-year period, and all the equipment necessary and other types of surgical supplies to help Arvin and other programs do more modern cataract surgery. And so when the donations dried up, that's when I set up Oralab, which now has about 10% of the global market share. And we've, as you can see, we've reduced the price point dramatically, where our technology, our product offering is really no different than Alcon, which used to be owned by Novartis, which has probably 46% of the ophthalmic market. So we proved out that you could basically create the same product line, intraocular lenses, pharmaceuticals, sutures, surgical blades, different types of ophthalmic equipment, but you could dramatically lower the price point simply by demystifying technology to see how you can be in control of it, and also removing all the non-value added margins in the whole supply chain. Next slide, please. So these are just a few examples of different things I'm working on to, again, lower the price point. And I'll mention the last one because that's well on its way. Oralab collaborating with a big Indian pharmaceutical company to make bevacizumab, already regulatory approved for colorectal cancer, but used off-label in ophthalmology. We're figuring out how to reduce the price point of the yearly 9 or 10 injections from around $22,000 to something between $50 and $100. Next slide, please. And then here's an example of another company that I helped start, a social enterprise, where we're making a Bluetooth-enabled program that enables the consumer or a non-medical technician to basically test their own hearing and program the device where you don't need an audiologist and all the equipment, and where it's being sold for $99 versus $1,700 to $3,000 for this type of technology. So again, through the design process and looking at the whole supply chain, and then also having the right value system in the business, how do you make a product like a hearing aid more into a consumer electronic product rather than a medical device? So that's what we were able to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you, David and Paul. Next up, Dr. Rockefeller Tang is going to talk about some of our efforts aimed at improving adoption of technologies through human capacity development, and specifically talking about our efforts to introduce and implement a new training model.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. So in global health, as it has always sort of been laid out, most of the efforts that have been put in the past have been focused on creating quantity, right? So we need more doctors, we need more nurses, we need more health workers. And so a function of that has been a lack of focus at the same time on the quality of people that are being produced. In most of these developing and emerging markets, the major health outcomes disparities are due to the lack of human capacity and very inefficient systems. So when you look at it from a holistic sort of top-down view, these are two core issues that would have to be addressed if you at any point were trying to impact health outcomes for those populations. Like I said, in the past, some of those previous programs have focused on creating quantity, often about task shifting and creating lower cadres of health workers or mid-level providers, as opposed to spending the energy to create the topmost or most well-trained people in that field. Next slide. So for our work in Ghana, if you're not familiar, we focused our model on creating all cadres of people involved in delivering emergency medical care, right? So we, at the forefront, trained nurses, trained emergency physicians, who then went on to train emergency medical technicians, who are the ones who are operating these, the out-hospital systems, the EMS crews, ambulances, and things of that nature. What came out of this is that we now have leaders who are capable of not only understanding the specialty, but growing the specialty in organic ways that it has to grow within the specific population. The folks that have trained with our program are involved in clinical research that is of interest to them as they try to look at adjusting and influencing policy to, again, affect the outcomes and the health of the population in general. From sitting in the emergency department, they get a good sense of who's getting sick and who's coming to the hospitals. So it becomes natural to then try to seek ways in which you could prevent those large numbers or large volumes of people, or shift some of those patterns that you're seeing as you're working in these departments. So truly closing the gap between evidence-based interventions, new science, and current standards is something that these well-trained folks are capable of taking on. They learn emergency medicine and they apply it in their context. Oftentimes they run into this issue where there's new evidence that's out in more developed systems that maybe this intervention or this technique is the best to improve outcomes, but they don't necessarily have access to it, right? They have standards that operate in their systems. And so these folks who, again, have had the adequate training and really own their specialty are the ones who are going to be ones closing that gap between the new evidence that's coming out in more developed systems where interventional studies are happening versus the standards that they're operating with at that current time. Next slide.
So one of the things that we're interested in exploring is how to develop formal partnerships between engineering medicine clinicians and other practitioners in that space and engineers, or more broadly, designers. And over the past 14 years, we've been working on partnering with local clinical teams to identify unmet needs and define those unmet clinical needs. We've done this for 14 years in Ghana, specifically at Komfo-Anokye Teaching Hospital and Korle-Bu Teaching Hospital around topics related to obstetrics and gynecology. And more recently, partnering with Dr. Oteng and his physicians at CATH, Komfo-Anokye Teaching Hospital in Kumasi, Ghana, to look at unmet needs within the emergency medicine and physical medicine and rehabilitation space. So part of what is involved in this is identifying students, and my program manager, Caroline Sawyers, and I work to identify multidisciplinary students, typically at the undergraduate level, to train on learning techniques around the use of non-typical engineering design methods, including design ethnography, which includes performing interviews and observations, focus groups, to be able to capture qualitative information about stakeholder wants and needs, and then to be able to translate those wants and needs into these quantifiable specifications that you heard Jesse mention earlier. They do this primarily through a multi-month long clinical immersion experience. And then they go through a process with stakeholder input to prioritize the needs. So typically a team of students, if we're talking about emergency medicine at Komfo-Anokye Teaching Hospital, we would have somebody like Dr. Oteng and his colleagues, including Dr. Safa, who would be looking at the needs that the students have identified. And I should also mention that these students include not only University of Michigan students, but also in this case, students from KNUST in Kumasi, Ghana. They will prioritize their needs and with stakeholder input, select one or more needs to bring back to their respective campuses. So KNUST for the Ghanaian students, University of Michigan for our Ann Arbor-based students. And then they will work on developing concept solutions that would address those needs. So to date, we've had more than 400 student designers from around the world participate in these opportunities on more than 100 different capstone design projects with various different outcomes. Typically, the typical outcome is a very broad and unique educational experience for our student participants. Beyond that, a subset of the students will work on formalizing their work and disseminating their findings through conference papers, design competitions, journal manuscripts, and a smaller subset, as Paul alluded to, will take the next step to commercialize or implement. And so we've had some examples of technologies that have been developed in a classroom setting transition from the classroom into practice, but it's limited in nature. And we think that this is one potential pipeline that we can tap into as a challenge group through the Center for Global Health Equity to evaluate the technologies that are being developed and see which ones are worth pursuing out beyond the classroom. Connecting that back to our capacity building efforts, we have an interest in developing a novel global health technology training program. This would be targeting medical fellows and postgraduate degree recipients in partnering African institutions. Our pilot will be at CATH in Kumasi, Ghana. We will be looking to leverage interdisciplinary and sustainable models for building local research capacity to accelerate the development, implementation, and scaling of global health technologies. So we envision providing training experiences for fellows along part of this route of developing and implementing or commercializing technologies, specifically helping to determine and define the types of clinical studies that need to be performed after our students are done doing the benchtop testing, obtaining institutional review board approval locally to perform those clinical trials, interpreting and analyzing the results of the clinical trials, and also collecting important usability and other device data that is critical to informing iterative design. We think that part of this effort will help facilitate many of these technologies that are in the pipeline by giving us more information about their suitability for market adoption, as well as learning more about the context that you heard both Grace and Jesse talk about earlier. I'm going to hand it back to Dr. Oteng to finish up on this section.
Next slide. Okay, so the motivation for the novel training program from a physician standpoint is that in Ghana, we have graduate physicians who need to complete a fellowship to become trainers, right? So when you're designing a sustainable system, building a brand new specialty into a whole country, you got to think about how is that going to go beyond the ones that we were able to train by physically being on the ground. And the way in Ghana is to create fellows, and these fellows from their equivalent of the ACGME, which is the Ghana College of Physicians and Surgeons. Those fellows are the ones who are then formally able to train more practitioners of emergency medicine. So the fellowships is something that we've been working on sort of developing. The interaction that Kathleen's folks and my folks in Ghana have had has been very unique and very well received. In the emergency department there, we had the students from KNUST who would come by, and then they would work with their colleagues here at the University of Michigan who had traveled to Ghana, and they would spend time in the department standing by watching the clinical work being performed, and then pulling people aside, both nurses, technicians, as well as physicians, to say, hey, you know, how did that go for you? What might have made that easier for you? What things are missing? And then sort of starting that process over. This is an opportunity for us to learn more about the introduction of devices into direct patient care, right? This is an opportunity for these folks to gain an area of specialty and an area of knowledge that could then be translated to other settings. They could then teach others how to think about studying some of these devices, or creating an environment in which they could start to try to implement new technologies, or create platforms for which they can understand how new technologies could be applied to their specific cases. Next slide. So this unique opportunity would include a navigation of the Ghanaian FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, who has to approve any new devices that would be introduced into the environment. It would be an opportunity for the creation of clinical protocols for device testing. What does that look like? Who needs to be, what patients are the ones being selected? Who's not going to be selected? How do we go about making those kind of decisions? What kind of places are available for the clinical implementation of these devices? Along with the implementation comes the collection, or the need for collection tools in order to collect, you know, objective data in a way that we can scientifically say, this is what's happening, this is how it's changing care, or this is how it's helping, or this is how maybe it's falling short of some of the things that we have wanted to measure. Looking at outcomes measures is one way, but outcome measures are a broad group of sort of descriptors, and we would need to come up with more objective ways to say this is better for the patient, or this has helped the patient along their course. This would include the sharing of findings and scientific outcomes with similar communities. You know, the Ghanaian environment is not unique. There are plenty of countries that look just like it, or want to look just like it. And so there's definitely an opportunity for us to take the newfound knowledge and to help translate, hopefully, the better outcomes to other environments. The findings here also importantly will help inform design, iteration, and translational efforts, right? So in the work that we've done in Ghana, there's been a couple of devices that are pretty far advanced and are near ready for implementation clinically. But there are others that maybe got to a point and now need more feedback on their potential feasibility in these environments. And that sort of iterative process, creating the process by which we can start to introduce some of these technologies is potentially transformative in these environments.
Thank you, Rocky. I'm going to hand it off to Paul to summarize things and also potentially highlight share his thoughts about kind of this more bottom-up approach versus top-down approach for commercialization of technology in this space.
So thanks, Kathleen. So, just to review, the objective of the challenge group is to reduce morbidity and mortality through the development and demonstration of scalable models for strengthening global health technology, commercialization, implementation programs. And there are three basic areas, and you can think of them sort of as the research end, looking at improving the design, the implementation end, whether that's commercialization or through other means, and then sort of the training area, the human capacity development, and they're all interrelated with each other. As I said before, we're very early on in this, and so we're fairly comfortable with that basic framework, but things are going to change as we move forward and as we progress, and we're learning a lot about, we already have learned quite a bit about interacting with each other and the different stages of that. But I would just highlight, I mean, just if you look at the my colleagues on this call, it's the breadth and depth of experience, and this isn't everyone who's involved in this, is really remarkable. And this is what makes it great to be at a place like University of Michigan. I think this is what makes it so the Center for Global Health Equity can have an unusual impact in the world. So with that, I would open it up to questions. I'm not sure how are we getting the questions? Joe.
Well, what a great session. The kind of the foundations of the center is we're trying to figure out how to have a different kind of impact, changing the way people's lives are lived, and you're directly speaking to that. And we're also trying to figure out how to collaborate differently, both with each other at the university, but with our partners in low resource settings. So well done. I was expecting good things, but this is great, and I know you're still storming along. So so well done. I have a couple of questions, but maybe I could just start with one, and that revolves around the word design. Often we use that word quite liberally. In fact, if you look at the word design for the center, we want all of our initiatives co-designed with partners in low resource settings. We don't want to be designing things for them without them. In education, we're often talking about designing curricula, designing training. We're talking about processes. If I understand your use of the word design, it's always linked to a technology or a product. As Jesse said, something somebody can buy, but design is always linked to a technology or product, something somebody could buy. You're not talking about design just as a process, independent of a technology or product that somebody could buy. Do I have that correct? How you're thinking of the word design?
I think you do have it correct in terms of how we're defining the scope of what this challenge group is tackling. Otherwise, it becomes unmanageable. However, I think a lot of what the examples that you are giving, designing a curriculum, for example, we've used the same similar design processes that we would use to design a technology, like a medical device for use in a low resource setting, to design curriculum or to design a program for example, the training program. So I think the methodology that we're describing, or not, we didn't get into the details about, the specifics of the design processes per se that we're using to design the technologies in this talk, but they are amenable to other scenarios. We're just defining the scope of what our group is working on around global health technology. And I would say we are actively using kind of our core design methodology, a co-creative design process, a human-centered design process to design other things that the group is working on, like our training program.
Very nice.
Can I add one thing, Kathleen? Sorry. I just wanted to add that I think that it's absolutely true that design is an overloaded term. In fact, if you search the syllabus of any university, it's the most commonly used term. It's in every course. You learn how to design something, whether it's in LS&A or in engineering or anywhere else. And I think there's many ways to define it. And I want to agree with Kathleen, but I guess what I would say is that I think an important point to make is that we're not saying that technology, like a global health technology, solves all of the problems. And I think what we're really saying is, during the process of developing a technology, can we go through something where we say, what is that probability of success? Is technology an answer here? And how can we get the right technology that will actually affect people's health, right? And sometimes the answer is, oh, a technology is not the answer. Maybe we need something else, right? Maybe it is a process change, right? So I think in many times engineering has failed, and I'll use this as my own discipline here, because we go straight for the technology because that's what we do, right? And I agree that we have scoped this to be about developing technologies, but I think an answer can very likely be, for this particular case, maybe a new technology is not the right path. But we want to be able to know that. And I think that's what we're talking about in terms of improving the design, is to talk about making those decisions about technologies.
The other thing I'll add is that some of us in this challenge group are actually quite skeptical of the degree to which a technology by itself can actually move the needle on these things. And I think that helps to keep us all honest, because we will be looking for that, that boundary that Jesse was just talking about, which is, when is a technology the right solution? When do you need to do more than the technology, and when is a technology the wrong solution altogether?
Yeah, maybe if I could just add to Kentaro's comment, I've seen that a lot in the health system. People drop off a technology, but they haven't dropped off how we should be interacting with that technology, so it fails to meet its potential. And the road seems to be littered with those of things that they were never balanced with the human factors that need to be taken into consideration, and they fail to meet their mark. So it seems like the technology is necessary, but never sufficient to reach the goal. So
if I could just add on that, I think that's why adding the commercialization aspect makes this a little bit different, because it's not enough to do the technology. If you're actually going to, any company that's commercializing it has to recognize that there are other aspects. You're going to have to figure out the distribution network. You're going to have to figure out the training. You're going to have to figure out all those other elements of it. And by focusing, as Kathleen said, on products and the technology around the products, but thinking about it through to the end, we can't ignore those other issues. We have to be paying attention to them. And then, as Jesse was talking about, incorporating whatever we learn from that into the design up front presents us with some, hopefully will present us with some unusual outcomes that will be productive.
maybe if I could add just one closing comment there, and then I'm going to be quiet and let others have the floor. I know we have plenty of time for discussion, but I do think that's the unique aspect of this challenge group, and probably of our center, is bringing in the commercialization aspect. And how do you create the value, the energy to propel the effort? About 10 days ago, we had our big national global health meetings called the Consortium of Global Universities for Global Health. And Tony Fauci was one of our keynote speakers. And when posed the question, what do we really need in global health right now, especially in light of what we've learned from the COVID-19 epidemic? His big statement was, we need low and middle income countries making their own vaccines. He said, you know, and he's a big veteran from the HIV epidemic. He said the big game changer was all of a sudden when low income countries such as India started making HIV drugs. That's what suddenly disturbed and disrupted the environment and was the big game changer. So now with mRNA technologies, I wonder who's going to take that on. Because I do think in the years ahead, Ghana and Peru and other places are going to be making their own vaccines. And who's going to be propelling that effort? It's not going to be the companies here, because they're not going to want to necessarily create the competition. But it's very much true. Right now, we've got this huge disequilibrium where all the vaccines are going to the rich in the rich countries. In the low and middle income countries, the countries our center is supposed to focus on, they're not going to see much, if any, of that vaccine for at least a couple of years. And we're going to have this huge inequity until those countries can make their own vaccines. So making vaccines is going to be different now with this mRNA technology. And I wonder who's going to take that on? Who's going to be thinking about the devices, the equipment, the technologies? So suddenly that's going to be happening in low resource countries. And there's not going to be this high barrier like there is now. That's going to be the big game changer. I don't know, Paul, if you have thoughts from your William Davidson Institute perspective, any speculation, who's gonna carve out that pathway of commercializing and making that a product line, vaccine production in low income countries? Any crystal ball speculations?
Well, I would tell you, but I'm investing in them first, and I want to wait before the price goes up. But I will say, generally speaking, we have definitely been making the argument to countries that low and middle income countries, particularly in healthcare, that's where the growth is taking place, both in population and spending. And so if you want to figure out, you want to see your growth as a company, as a private sector company, you've got to figure out how to sell profitably in those markets. And even more so, if you don't, some companies in those markets are going to figure out how to operate there profitably, and they're going to turn around and eat your lunch in the United States and Europe and whatnot later on, which from our perspective at WDI is fine, because we're about developing businesses opportunities there. But I'm partly saying this to the companies to encourage them to start making investments in the multinationals to start making investments in these countries. Diabetes care, DaVita pulled out of India a few years ago. If they can't figure out how to operate profitably there, what's going to happen with the company that does figure out how to operate profitably there? And why wouldn't they turn around and look at Europe and look at the United States as profitable markets down the road? So I think there are definitely opportunities there. You know, I never, you wouldn't want to follow my advice on stock market picks though, but I'll say generally, I think there's going to be stuff coming out of there. Kathleen, David, do you have something?
Sure. Yeah, I wanted to talk about design, and I look at design as what are the levers to change the whole ecosystem. So when we started Oralab, our price point was $10, and we started with known technology, and all these other competitors decided, oh, looks like Oralab's making money. We'll enter the low end of the market also, and they became our competitors. And that was we started in '92 when India was doing 800,000 cataract surgeries a year, and all these new entrants came into the pool. They started developing their own ophthalmic industry, and in like 6 years, India was doing 5 million cataract surgeries a year, primarily driven by other competitors in this very price competitive market, which you really don't see too much in healthcare anywhere. And so I think we combined all that with training programs in surgery through leading ophthalmic institutions, combined with low-cost consumables, combined with programs that had it in their DNA to have tiered pricing where free was the lowest price, and they were offering cataract surgery with the same result as a wealthy person could get, so that everybody, all the consumers started marching to those programs, which made all the other competitors change how they were providing their products, their services, how they were pricing it. And so now India is doing like 7 million cataract surgeries a year. It's the most of any country. And so it's like, it's all about what are the levers to change the competitive landscape in favor of the consumer, in favor of affordability, using price as the weapon.
Kathleen, there are a couple of questions posted. I think, did you want to address them?
Sure, I can pose them to the panel. I'm not sure if they can see them as well. So Tim is asking, I wonder if you can talk about the evaluation aspect of efforts like these, measuring the degree to which the technologies deliver the effect that they were designed to produce. Do you envision that as coming from different folks or built into the process as an integral part? And where does the money come from to do that evaluation?
So I can chime in on part of that. Going back to the commercialization path that we were talking about, one of the things we'd be looking at along the way is the factors that are going to play into, is this product likely to be commercializable? Is it likely to be viable in the market? And to do that, I mean, we both our own staff at WDI and we sponsor a lot of student teams that can help do market analysis and things like that. So we're planning on incorporating that in some of the educational programs as well.
But how about further, does anybody have comments about further downstream? So Rocky and then Jesse.
Yeah, so from the physician side, a lot of those markers are already there. We have a lot of those measurements of, like, for example, let's take sepsis, for example, right? So a patient comes in to a hospital here and we want to know as quickly as possible whether they're septic or not. And then there are measurements as to, once you decide that they have this process going on, you have to do X, Y, Z interventions, right? So right now, one of the big problems in Ghana is the first determination. There needs some technology to help you determine that this person is septic. So you have a baseline. What we've been doing with building the clinical capacities, you have a baseline of what the function looks like now. Then you could compare it to the introduction of this device. So a simple one would be, how quickly are people getting to their first diagnosis of sepsis, right? And then, so because of some of that work having already been done, some of those metrics from the clinical standpoint, some of those metrics are already there. And so you could build them into the design, right? So some of the advantage of a device from here, or a device being developed now for a process that's already being tracked in the United States, is that you can add on things that we didn't have before in the original design. So some of the questions are already there to be answered from a clinical standpoint. And so you would just build that into the implementation bit.
Yeah, so I think I just wanted to add a point. I'm going to interpret the question a little bit from Tim here. I believe that he's speaking to perhaps some of the program evaluation type of work that happens. RCTs, we know, are very, very expensive. And so if we are intending this to actually reduce mortality, some technology, who's going to actually check that this technology in that context had that impact that we're looking for? I think there's lots of answers to this question. It depends a lot on who the organization is. If it's a company, you might have a regulatory process that requires that evaluation to happen. So when you say who's paying for it, during part of the commercialization might be part of that, but that's not actually what I wanted to speak to. I wanted to speak to the point where it said the effect that they were designed to produce. I think that right now, when you talk to engineers about medical devices, or really any device, there's a technical functionality that we get from talking to the users. So we might talk to clinicians like Dr. Oteng or whoever and say, okay, this technology is intended to have this functionality, and here's its technical performance. And we're able to evaluate that, and our techniques are able to predict that, and we can test that in the lab, in situ, et cetera, through field tests. I think you're asking a great question, which is, what is the effect it's intended to produce, though it's designed to produce? I don't think that they're designed right now to, within the Ghana, like the context of the country of Ghana, or even within a healthcare system, take that healthcare rate of like, how much sepsis do we have in this entire system, and reduce that. We're looking at the individual case. And I think that we do need to be thinking on that system level, and all of these different levers that can be used to try and say, okay, are you going to actually use this technology? How many people are going to use it? You know, how is this going to get? Are the people going to be trained to be able to get the performance that you can get from this technology, but you're not getting right now because we didn't train people to use it properly? So all of these things come together to have the effect I believe you're talking about. I don't think that the technologies at the moment are necessarily designed to have that effect, in the sense of considering all of those other things that affect it, where you're hearing Paul, David, you know, Rocky, everyone talk about these other factors that affect that impact that you're talking about. So I think one of the things that I'm very excited about within this challenge group is the ability to talk all together and say, what is that? How are we defining impact, right? What are the levers that will affect that impact, right? And how can we design technologies to say, yes, we will check that it's going to get that impact we're talking about, and evaluate it. And I think as a researcher, as an academic, I think that I need to get the funding through grants or whatever to do the evaluations to prove that it did reduce morbidity, right? And I don't think we're doing that now. I think we're saying, oh, it has this functionality, it can reduce morbidity, but it's not actually doing it, right? So I think that's the challenge. I think to me, that's the big challenge, is to say, how do you know that this thing where you know the functionality is there, how do you know it's actually going to have the impact you want? And so that's a great question. I think that's one of the challenges. I think that's a grand challenge for me. That's the way I'm thinking about it.
And I think too that it's a hard question for us to answer in a specific manner right now because of what Paul said. We're so early on in the process where we're still trying to identify which initial technology or technologies to pursue through commercialization or implementation process. But I think keeping evaluation front and center as a step in that process is really important. So thanks for that question. The next question we had from Nora was regarding the process of following a product from design to adoption in a low middle income country. Is funding primarily from a for-profit entity such as venture capitalists, or are there philanthropic funds available? So maybe David and Paul want to start us off here.
Yeah, I raise grants into nonprofits. Like most of Aura Lab's startup costs are it's grant funding or self-funding from nonprofit sources. I've created for-profit social enterprises where you can bring in grants and equity together, where the grants have to be utilized according to the tax-exempt purposes of the donor. So I've raised large amounts of funding for debt financing to help service delivery and eye care scale. So there's a whole continuum of funding. You can look at grants, recoverable grants, program-related investments that foundations make, private foundations that where they have to give away 5% every year, and they can also do debt and equity against that 5% as long as it's in accordance with their tax-exempt purposes, the use of the funds. Or you can do debt like equity or equity like debt, or you can do equity. And so I've been doing all of them for the various enterprises that I've helped develop. And I would say that in developing social enterprises oriented towards low-income people, particularly if you have groundbreaking technology, you have to be mindful of who the investors are, that they have the right mentality. Most investors supporting developments, for instance, out of universities, are looking for a 3 to 5 year exit. That is, they want to get their money out and they want to make a lot of money. And that's kind of the trap that so much development is stuck in. They're looking for, it's all designed for that early exit to make a lot of money. So how do you create the right type of patient capital for things to have enough time to be successful in the market at a lower price point, rather than selling out for a higher price point and some moment of liquidity where they're selling the company or doing an IPO. So financing is key.
So I would echo David in saying the answer is yes. You would be interested in funding wherever it was coming from. The only thing I would add is there is a value to this funding process, especially from the private investors, because in order to get an investment from them, you're going to have to make the case that this product is of a sufficiently low cost, that it's going to be able to reach these customers, and that the volume is large enough to warrant the investment. And so it's sort of a market checkpoint of, does this really make sense? Is this going to have the impact? And it's going to have to show that you're able to sell it, you're able to distribute it, you have the people on the ground to implement it, and that the systems are in place to make this work. And if you can't show that, you're not going to get the investing. So that there's sort of a value that group brings beyond the capital investment.
A lot of untapped money is really from very large asset managers like governments, pension funds, insurance companies, and they're hungry for social investment. So in governments, you have pots of money for low-cost debt financing, pots of money for very patient equity capital and grant funding, and often they make it available in combination for development purposes. But there aren't that many skillful utilizers of that funding out there, but it's certainly out there.
Joe, you had your hand raised, and we also have a question from Roy. Do you want to ask your question first?
Let me defer to Roy, and if there's time, I have a question.
Okay, so Roy's question is, coming back to vaccines, an equal challenge, in addition to production, might be the lack of critical infrastructure in LMICs required for effective distribution. For example, reliable refrigeration. Any comments on this?
I get the sentiment, but I think what you would find is that the refrigeration is less of an issue than one is actually going to find. I think where we find the infrastructure issues around well-trained people, and then creating more efficient systems out of what they already have. A lot of countries, like I do a lot of work in Ghana. I've done some work in Ethiopia. A lot of countries, when you get on the ground, have a lot more. They're just not utilizing what they have well, right? And so a lot of that gap could be closed by creating more efficient systems. We did a couple of projects with students from WDI around payments, just an example, in the emergency department in Ghana. A lot of people have to pay upfront for imaging to get an x-ray, things like that, right? And we found that patients spend on average about 4 days in the emergency department at a major hospital in Accra, the capital. And just from the work we did with the students, we realized that everybody there is on their phone 90% of the time, doing most of their transactions with their bank digitally, but the hospital has no way for them to interface digitally. So we're still waiting for somebody to go to a bank physically at an ATM, withdraw money, come back to the hospital to pay for a shoulder x-ray, when on their phone, we could have made the transaction and moved on, right? So a lot of the space as related to that was not necessarily creating new technology, but sort of making the process more efficient and utilizing what the clientele, what the patients really are already using. So I think when it comes to stuff like the vaccines, yes, there's some infrastructure issues, but I think a lot of it is going to be in, making the systems that they have in place more efficient, right? And closing that gap in that way.
David, and then Kentaro.
Yeah, I think that infrastructure like energy or water or whatever, it can always be solved somehow. They already are solving those issues. I think the big issue is the fact that here in the United States or Europe or Japan, there are well-developed let's say, medical device industries. There's a whole foundational base to medical device companies that doesn't exist even in countries like India or China. Well, China, yes, India, it's coming up. So you have the challenge is to get governments to enable concessionary or duty-free importation of components coming from elsewhere, because so much of the components are sourced from very few places. And so how do you have the right type of government program to enable a medical device industry to take off, to kind of leapfrog by having good sourcing globally for all these items where they're not paying duty. In India, duty on components is more than duty on finished goods, which is kind of crazy. So by looking at the laws and how governments support development of medical device industry, for instance, I think that that's a key area for policy development.
I was just going to say that I agree with what Rocky said, but I do think that there are contexts where the cold chain, the technology of the cold chain, in fact, has room for improvement. But it's also the case that very often it's in exactly those places where, let's say, there's not, reliable electrical supply to the local clinic, and so even if you had a great technology, you're dealing with a larger institutional and political issue that, in fact, then goes back to institutions, which is what I think Rocky's point was. So there probably are places where cold chain technology would be helpful, but it's not clear without understanding the context better whether the technology is the main bottleneck or something else.
We had another question. Oh yeah, Jesse, you want to chime in there?
Yeah, I just to build on Kentaro's point, I think that there's Shobita's not here, but we have someone from the Ford School who's talking about the policy issues that perhaps David was talking about. But a lot of these, when you talk about lack of a critical infrastructure, I think it's a different infrastructure, right? And so the vaccine needs this cold chain technology because they developed it with the assumption that we have cold chain technology that's distributed in this way. I would argue that here in Michigan, I know that we've had some freezer failures and have lost some vaccine that way. So I'm not sure it works super effectively here either. But I think that the answer is to say, well, maybe just this tech, I think in other cases, I don't want to speak to vaccines, the technology transfer is we're taking something that was designed for a particular infrastructure environment and operating environment and institutional environment and policy environment. And we're just saying, okay, here's a completely different environment. Why isn't it working? And it's like, well, we should be saying, well, hey, M-Pesa works super great. Let's build all of our technology to have digital payments as its backbone, right? And use what's there and design our technologies to work within that environment. So, I think it's from both sides, is you can improve the cold chain technology, but maybe you can improve the vaccine technology to work in the environment that is in existence wherever it is. And I think the really exciting point is to say, well, if we actually want the impact of people like getting vaccinated and raise that number, how do we do that within this context? What's the process to make that happen? Is it to go with the cold chain technology, or is it to develop and generate vaccines in country in a different way, right? I think that's what's exciting to me. And I'll pass it to Kathleen because we're running low on time.
Yes, so I just wanted to tackle this last question, then hand it off to Joe to wrap up. From Arvin, can you talk perhaps to using AI in medicine as a force multiplier for augmentation efficiency? Is this a viable direction for some questions in the medical workplace?
So yeah, this is actually an interesting question because I just, in my own department here in Michigan, we have a lot of partnerships, but one of our partnerships with it is with an ultrasound group and a couple of ultrasound companies who are super interested in AI. And the question I was posed last week, which I then rightfully deflected to my colleagues on the ground in Ghana who are working with ultrasound was, if a company wanted to spend money on AI, should it be in teaching people how to use the ultrasound or interpreting images that people are getting, right? Which is a really interesting conceptual question, right? So is it that people don't know how to hold the ultrasound to get the proper images, or they can get the images and need to know what the image is telling them. So there is significant interaction currently with clinical medicine and AI already going on in these lower resourced environments. I think there's just as much opportunity, if not more, where maybe you don't have an expert holding the device, but could you aid them? Could you aid someone who's not an expert in interpreting or creating a clinical picture off of an image? So yes, there's definitely room. The work is already happening. I know a lot of it, as we see from emergency medicine, is around imaging and diagnostics, right? So I'm looking at a picture. What does the picture say? And sort of creating yes or no questions. Is there blood? No blood? Those kind of things. So.
Did anyone else want to jump in here for this one? Jesse?
I just want to point out that when we develop AI for other contexts, that we need to be really careful about how we're using the training data. So I'm an optimization person, and we deal with a lot of this machine learning and feature selection. And I think that even if you look at something like Apple's Face ID, right, like the failures it's had as it's gone to a different context because of their training data. So I think it's really important, this interaction with clinicians on the ground and getting, good training data sets and validation for AI. I don't think that the AI that we train for a clinical context in the US is going to be very useful in a different context. And that we would need to rethink it and to go to a different context.
And I think Rocky also raised a really interesting point, which I'll just rephrase as, what is the role of the human in the loop? And that's a topic of interest across multiple fields, and one that is being potentially will be addressed through some of the technologies that this group pursues in the form of task shifting or task sharing technologies, but trying to again understand how best can we take advantage of the capabilities of the human in a particular process. So with that, given time, Joe, I'll hand it back to you to close.
Well, thank you for just a terrific session. On behalf of somebody whose career has largely been anchored in the health system, thanks for your dedication to the types of enabling technologies and new products that are going to particularly be helpful for those in low resource settings. As Rocky was talking about the story of what it takes to get a shoulder x-ray, I think a lot of us were groomed along the line of a learned helplessness. We work in our health systems, this is what we do. And thank God there are people going in trying to challenge us to get us thinking differently and trying to come up with different solutions. I think this is going to be great work, and it's going to fit so nicely with the center. And it was just a beautifully orchestrated seminar, so thank you. I'd like to encourage everyone to attend our next seminar. You can read about it in the chat. It's April 22nd. We're trying to have discussions here around global health, equity, getting people connected to some of the different pockets and individuals around our university. Sometimes people say, well, what about the national conversation? Where else are these on? And we want to share some of the national conversations that have been going on around global health, where you can connect to those. In particular, that consortium of universities for global health that I just referenced earlier, it's one of the big conversations that universities tie into. Well, what is that? Is that relevant to people who are interested in global health equity? So we're going to share some of the learnings and how people engage with that from across our universities. So please plan on joining us again, April 22nd at this same time period, 5 o'clock. But again, thanks to our panelists and to those who are able to engage and participate with questions and chats. And I wish everyone a good evening. Thank you.